Hello there one more time. Social Studies 30-1 here. Moving into Cold War Part 4. I'm actually going to divide this lesson into two different parts. So this is the Cold War Part 4A, and then the next class we'll look at Cold War Part 4B. Maybe I should have just called them 4 and 5, but we'll worry about that next time. Today's topic is a look at what are known as proxy wars. And just to get you up to speed, in part one, we examined the beginning of the Cold War, your wartime conferences. We looked at the Soviet satellites, the establishment of the Soviet sphere of influence, and the American sphere of influence in Western Europe. We moved on to the division of Germany, the splitting of Berlin in two with the Berlin Wall. We talked about brinkmanship through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've looked at non-alignment, deterrence, and so on. What we look at now um, are the proxy wars. And so this is some actual fighting during the Cold War, but keep in mind that throughout the entirety of the Cold War, Americans and Soviets never actually share gunfire. They never exchange gunfire with each other. An American never shoots at a Soviet and vice versa. It's important that doesn't happen because that could trigger World War III. And by this point, both sides have nuclear weapons. So the last thing you would want would be a World War III involving those two countries. But they still fight. The ideologies will still clash with each other, but they're going to use other countries for the fighting, and they're going to use other people to do, by and large, the fighting. And so this is a very dark, I mean, there's a lot of dark sides of the Cold War, but this is probably the darkest side of the Cold War, how each superpower used other countries and other people to do the fighting for them. So a proxy war is when you fight one another without actually fighting each other directly, using other countries and other people. We'll look at a few examples. The two we'll study today will be Korea and Vietnam. You've probably heard about Vietnam. Korea is a lesser known war, so let's get into it. You need to understand a bit of the historical background behind Korea before we can get into the lesson. So you need to understand that in the years leading up to World War II, Korea was actually conquered and occupied by Japan. And as you know, Japan lost World War II. The Americans nuked them in 1945 and knocked them out of the war. And so what happened with Korea was that it no longer belongs to Japan, but who does it really belong to? And so what they did after Japan lost World War II was they took Korea, and I'm showing you the map here right now, and they split it in two. They split it along what was known as the 38th parallel. 38th parallel line of latitude that split North Korea from South Korea. And this was done just so that Korea didn't fall into chaos and civil war. Um, the economy lacked infrastructure. Of course, they don't really have a government because Japan was their government and now they're gone. So to avoid the chaos of a power vacuum, they split it in two. There's a North Korea that is going to be rebuilt and supervised by the Soviet Union, and there's going to be a South Korea, which is going to be supervised and rebuilt by, of course, America, your two superpowers, and World War II. Given that the Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, it's only natural that North Korea would evolve into a communist dictatorship, which it does. And then given that America is democratically capitalist, it only makes sense that South Korea would also evolve into a democratically capitalist country, which it does. And in fact, to this day, both countries still maintain those ideologies, those opposing ideologies, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Capital of North Korea, as you can see here, is Pyongyang, and then South Korea, of course, is Seoul. And so that is the division, the split of Korea at the end of World War II, 1945. And then what happens? In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea, with the goal being to unify both Koreas into one under the leadership of North Korea. So North Korea invades the South. They want to conquer it, make the whole country communist, a dictatorial communist state. And of course, the Americans won't allow that to happen. They invoke what is called the Truman Doctrine. We've already learned about the Truman Doctrine, the containment of the spread of communism. So, acting under the Truman Doctrine, the Americans are able to push through a UN Security Council resolution that allows UN action to prevent North Korea from taking over South Korea, um, which is exactly what happened. So you need to understand that the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was a UN operation. The UN was preventing North Korean aggression into the South. But understand that it was mainly an American driven war. It was motivated by the Americans. They sent way more soldiers than anyone else, and they paid way more money than anyone else because it's in American interest to prevent the spread of communism. That's your Truman Doctrine. So what you get are the Soviets helping the North and the Americans helping the South. Another caveat you should also understand, the Americans and the UN put troops in South Korea first. So North Korea never gets the aid in terms of soldiers from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never put soldiers in North Korea because what could happen is you could easily have a Soviet kill an American or vice versa, which could trigger World War III. So the Soviets will send money, supplies, and weapons to help the North, but they never send soldiers, and that's really important. So phase one of the Korean conflict, the North invades the South. Phase two of the Korean conflict, with the American and UN support, the South fights back and drives North Korea way back up into North Korea. So they drive the invading forces back into North Korea. In fact, they drive them so far, they nearly drive them clear into China. There's a man-made, or I should say, a physical barrier between North Korea and China. It's called the Yalu River. The Yalu River separates China from North Korea. And the Americans and the UN and the South Koreans did such a good job of driving the North out of the South, they nearly drive them into China. And so China is actually getting concerned. Um, they can see the American and UN troops across the Yalu River. And from a Chinese perspective, they're way too close for comfort because China's thinking, well, what's stopping them from coming clear into China and conquering us? You need to understand that as of 1949, China had also had its own communist dictatorship. And they know very well about the Truman Doctrine. And they know that the Americans don't want communism in China or any part of the world. And so the Chinese react out of fear that the Americans will soon drive into China and conquer China and remove the Chinese government. So phase two is the South driving the North way back up into the North, almost into China. Um, the Chinese freak out, understandably, and the Chinese commit 1 million soldiers to help the North Koreans drive out the Americans in South Korea. And so that is now phase three. With the support of 1 million Chinese troops, um, the Chinese and North Koreans drive the South Koreans and the Americans back into South Korea, deep into South Korea. They nearly drive them into the ocean. And that's phase three of the Korean conflict. North drives out the South. That, by the way, was the biggest American military retreat in history. They were running for their lives, being chased by a huge Chinese army, North Korean army, and so on. The Americans are fleeing basically for their lives. And this takes us to 1953. And so by 1953, the UN brokers a peace between the two sides, and they agree to divide Korea along the original border, which was the 38th parallel. And that's stage four of the Korean conflict. So the UN brokers a peace between the two sides, and they settle on the original 38th parallel or border between North and South Korea. By the way, that border still stands today. There is still a North Korea that is communist. There is a South Korea that is democratic and capitalist. And they call the border today the DMZ, which stands for the Demilitarized Zone. To cross it would be an act of war. It's probably the most hostile and tense place on earth, the DMZ. It's not a place that you would go visit. Um, because technically the Korean War never ended. Technically, they're still at war, and from time to time, both sides renew the fighting and they fire at each other. And you're probably well aware of Kim Jong un and his antics in North Korea. He's developed nuclear missiles, he's got nuclear capacity, and anytime he launches a missile, that is not armed with warhead, but he's launching those missiles just to flex his muscles and show what he could do if he was motivated, if he felt threatened by America, the West, or South Korea. If he wanted to, he could easily arm one of those missiles with a nuclear warhead and fire it at Seoul and quite easily strike it and destroy part of the population. To this day, there's still an American military presence in South Korea because I said the war never really ended. It is the focal point of conflict on the planet. If you were looking for a place where World War III could start, where a nuclear war could start, you would probably look at the tension between North and South Korea. So back to our notes. Yeah, we've pretty much talked about all those things. The Korean conflict, 1950 to 1953. Canadians fought in Korea. As I said, it was a UN action, so it was almost a global response to North Korean aggression. But in the end, I guess you could say the Truman Doctrine did work in that the Americans did prevent communism from taking over in South Korea. One more concept you should be thinking about too. The Americans are really worried about what is known as a domino theory. They're afraid that if they allow one Southeast Asian country to fall to communism, that pretty soon more Southeast Asian countries will fall to communism. The economies had not fully recovered after Japanese occupation before World War II. They lacked infrastructure. There was a lot of unemployment. There was political disunity and unhappiness. There was all kinds of crises that you would need for a communist revolution to happen. But in this case, the Americans contained it. The Truman Doctrine did work. A famous piece of art, you've probably heard of Pablo Picasso. Picasso's famous, of course, for his uh, style called Cubism, and he's famous for Guernica. It's probably the most famous of the Picasso paintings. Guernica was a painting depicting the German napalming, firebombing of the Spanish fishing village of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. One of his lesser known works, of course, is Massacre in Korea. And historians and artists have often wondered what Picasso's trying to show. You have Korean civilians on the left, women, children, babies, unborn babies, and then, of course, aggressors on the right. The debate is who are the soldiers with the weapons and why are they depicted the way they are? So, one theory would suggest, well, the guys on the right are North Koreans because they were the aggressors that began the Korean conflict. And that could be true. But others have said, no, that could represent the Americans and that the Americans killed North Vietnamese civilians to stop the spread of communism in North Korea. I mean, that is the nature of a proxy war. Civilians die at the hands of one of the two superpowers. I'm not sure who's supposed to represent who. I find it interesting the way they've weaponized the soldiers. They're using weapons and armor that looks like it could be from the Middle Ages. I think it's just trying to show the barbarity of war, um, the evilness of war, and that this war really had no just cause. I mean, look at who they're about to kill, civilians. You're supposed to be saving these people. A proxy war is about helping civilians in another country, not killing those civilians in another country. And you're going to find that a common theme as we look at proxy wars. Ironically, you're killing the people that you're supposed to be saving. And that's what we see probably going on in this painting by Picasso here. Famous painting, but not as famous as Guernica. All right, back to our look at proxy wars. Our second example here is going to be a look at Vietnam. You've probably heard of Vietnam. No war, no conflict has been more represented than Vietnam in the media and movies and TV, etc. And I'm not quite sure why that is. I mean, I've got my own theories. I believe it's because it was the first war that was really televised, that was very well known. Photographers and filmmakers actually went out with the soldiers while they fought. So it was the first war that was really brought to your living room on your TV set back home in America. So it was very well known. American actions in Vietnam are highly questionable, as we're going to learn a bit more about in next week's lesson when I wrap up the course with you. So we'll leave that story for another time. But Vietnam has much the same backstory as does Korea. So during World War II and the years leading up to World War II, there's my map of Vietnam. Um, Japan occupied Vietnam just as they did Korea. And so you've got Japanese occupation actually through almost all of Southeast Asia here during the 1930s and early 1940s. And as we learn, Japan loses World War II, and that ends the era of Japanese occupation. But much the same thing as Korea. They can't really leave Vietnam in its state in 1945. There's political chaos, there's economic ruin, there's no infrastructure. They didn't want to leave it to evolve into a quagmire. So same thing as North Korea and South Korea. They take Vietnam and they cut it in two. There's a North Vietnam that is watched over, supervised by the Soviet Union, and there's a South Vietnam that is watched over and supervised by America. Again, North Vietnam evolves into a communist dictatorship because the Soviets were a communist dictatorship. And South Vietnam evolves into it's capitalist, probably more of a fascist regime than democratic, although on paper they're democratic. And so again, you've got, kind of the table set for another conflict involving communism versus capitalism and another proxy war. Again, there's a bit of a longer backstory about colonization in the French. We don't really need to know that, but just understand that as early as the 1950s, North Vietnam invades the South, again trying to unify the country under the leadership of a communist dictatorship. So we get that theme again. North invades the South, trying to unify the entire country under one banner, that of a communist dictatorship. And of course, the Americans just will not let that happen. Again, it's your domino theory. If they allow South Vietnam to fall to communism, then Cambodia is going to be next, and then Thailand, and then Laos, and it's the last thing they want to have to come and do, and is to drive out communism once it's already established in Southeast Asia. So anyway, North invades the South, and we get the Americans helping South Vietnam. The North, by the way, was led by a leader named Ho Chi Minh. You've probably heard of Ho Chi Minh if you've seen movies about Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh leads what are known as the Viet Cong, and they are civilians who train themselves to fight and conduct a guerrilla war. So Ho Chi Minh leads the Viet Cong. They are from the north. So they're trying to spread communism into the south. There's also a North Vietnamese military army, but Ho Chi Minh leads the Viet Cong, and they are a militia. And as you know, a militia is just regular people that train and fight and conduct a war. They can be very effective in that the militia, there's a lot of them. They're fighting for their homes, they're fighting for their families. You may not need to pay them. A militia can be very effective. They conduct what is called a guerrilla war. And so a guerrilla war is an unconventional war. So a conventional war is when soldiers from either side fight and kill each other. Um, Guerrilla war is a little different. Guerrilla war relies on ambush, hit and run techniques, sabotage, and infiltrating the enemy. And so guerrilla war is a war that you would use if you were outnumbered, if you were outgunned, if you were outmanned. On paper, North Vietnam should lose the war to the Americans. With American aid, the South should easily be able to halt the North Vietnamese invasion. The Americans have a way bigger military. It's far more sophisticated. They can raise a bigger army if they want. They've got better weapon. They've got better technology. One could argue they're even better trained. Um, but that's on paper. In reality, because of guerrilla warfare, the Americans didn't know it, but they had lost the war in Vietnam before it actually even started. They weren't prepared to fight guerrilla warfare. The American army, the American military, was built to fight on an open plain, an open field of battle where they can use their tanks, they can use their helicopter gunships, their air force, and they can use their maneuverability and their speed and mobility to easily overpower the enemy. And indeed, if the North had fought the Americans on an open field of battle, the war would have been over very, very, very quick. But they knew that. So the North Vietnamese fight in the jungles of Vietnam. They hide, they ambush, they use hit and run techniques. Ironically enough, most American soldiers that fought in Vietnam never actually saw the North Vietnamese enemy. They never laid eyes on them because they were well hidden, they were well camouflaged, they did a very good job at blending in with the local countryside and population. Another feature of guerrilla warfare that's important is that um, the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the enemies of the Americans, would disguise themselves and play themselves off as American allies. You know, they would pretend to be from the South. They'd pretend to be fighting with and alongside the Americans. And then when the Americans let their guard down, they would kill them. They would shoot them. They would sabotage them with bombs and all kinds of weapons, throwing helicopter or grenades into helicopters and sabotaging the American war effort. Um, in other words, if your enemy is not wearing the uniform of your enemy and they're wearing the uniform of your side, how would you know that they're your enemy? And so the Viet Cong were very smart in their tactics of guerrilla warfare. And in the end, that was the turning point of the war in Vietnam. The American strategy is let's kill so many North Vietnamese that they can't replenish their personnel. They can't replenish their army, and they'll be forced to surrender. But what the Americans didn't realize is that, you know, the North Vietnamese are fighting for their homes and their families. They were never going to run out of soldiers. And, and that, you know, if the Americans were to raid a village of suspected North Vietnamese enemy and burn some of the huts, you know, they just created an entire village of new enemies that they're going to have to come back and kill. So the American tactics just didn't work. And in this case, America failed to contain communism or the spread of communism. They failed to stop it from spreading into North Vietnam because by 1973, the Americans actually retreated and left Vietnam and it fell. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to North Vietnam. North Vietnam took over the entire country under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and made it a communist dictatorship. So uh, Truman Doctrine failed in the case of Vietnam. This war was really unpopular back home in America because it coincided with what is known as the anti-establishment movement. And I'll talk more about this later. But just to refresh your memory, the 1960s was the peak of the American civil rights movement, of liberalizing America. And so it's really hard to have that going on back home in America and American troops conducting this war in a faraway place in Vietnam that most people couldn't even find on a map. They didn't know why American soldiers were fighting that war, and a lot of American soldiers died in Vietnam, and no one ever really knew why they were fighting the war in the first place. So the war did not go over well back home in America. Um, and maybe because of that, that also is a reason why America failed to stop the spread of communism into South Vietnam. But for sure it did. They couldn't contain the spread of communism in Vietnam. What else do I have here for you? I don't know if I want to go much further than that. Yeah, you know what? I think we're going to stop it there, and we'll cover Central America. We'll save that for the next lesson. End of the Cold War is near, it is in sight, but we're not quite there yet.